the Severance barriers holding?
Yes, the technology is working.
What is up, everybody? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. Episode 7 of Severance is here, entitled Chikai Bardo, and in this episode we finally got a look at the mysterious testing room floor and what exactly Lumen has been putting Gemma through this entire time, along with getting a very interesting look at some of the flashbacks to Gemma and Mark's life before the accident, and how they started off as the happiest of couples but quickly descended into a strained marriage after many hardships, including getting a very tragic look at their repeated attempts to conceive a child. While at the same time, in our present-day timeline, we see Mark struggling with his own reintegration after his latest procedure of Ragabi flooding his chip, and the unforeseen side effects that it is now causing, and whether or not Mark will ever wake up at all. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not point out the phenomenal directorial debut of Jessica Lee Gagne, the show's usual cinematographer. She did quite an amazing job stepping into the director's chair for the very first time, bringing her usual very unique blend of cinematography, mixed with some of the most beautiful scene transition shots I've seen on the show thus far. And speaking of standout performances, I would also be remiss if I did not point out the phenomenal acting of Daichin Lachman in this episode as well. Up until this point, we have only seen Miss Casey in a small handful of scenes, and we have seen even less of Gemma. Seeing her get a chance to finally flesh out this character for the first time was very impressive to say the least, and she definitely carried this episode single-handedly. We really do see her go on quite an amazing journey from the start of the episode to the end, where we see her showcase every emotion from joy, sadness, heartbreak, tragedy, to trauma, and even the desperation to eventually escape. A tour-de-force performance indeed. The episode begins with a flashback scene to how Gemma and Mark first met when they were both donating blood, which I thought was a very interesting contrast considering the book that Gemma was reading while she was giving blood, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a story that shows the journey that Ivan goes on from being a high-respected and high-ranking official of the Court of Justice to grappling with his own mortality in the face of a dire illness. A metaphor of sorts of one confronting their own death, which is something that Gemma similarly goes through in this episode, which of course is reflected in the title itself, Chikai Bardo, which is essentially killing one's past self to make room for their next future self, or the death of one's ego self to make room for something new, which of course is exactly what Lumen is essentially doing to Gemma in this episode, breaking down and ultimately killing the persona of Gemma to make room for Miss Casey, which makes the contrast of her reading this book while donating blood that much more intriguing, as we see Gemma essentially donating the very gift of life while reading a story about one contemplating their own death. The story also shares an interesting parallel between Ivan Ilyich and Kier Eagan himself as well, as Kier was also faced with a very similar dilemma towards the end of his life, as he was forced to confront and struggle with the idea of his own mortality. And throughout the episode, not only do we see Gemma contemplating her own life and potential mortality, but we also finally get a glimpse at exactly what Lumen had been putting her through for the last 5 years, as we see that Lumen has essentially severed Gemma's personality into multiple different versions of herself, each of which are still Gemma, but neither of which share the same memories as the other, which appears to be Lumen's attempt to test this technology to see what will and will not transcend the Severance barrier, as Lumen attempts to make the final transition from Gemma into Miss Casey, through a rather grueling series of events where they are forcing Gemma to confront a new and different emotion in each one of these tailor-made rooms, which of course is where we meet the Lumen doctor, or the creepy dentist that has a very unhealthy obsession with Gemma, as they ultimately prepare her for the last and final room, which is entitled Cold Harbor, which of course is the file that Mark is stuck at 96% complete on currently. And one thing we quickly notice is each one of these rooms that Gemma is being put through are also named after another MDR file that they had previously worked on, confirming the direct connection of the work that MDR is doing to the testing room floor and them refining Gemma's personalities. And as we see Gemma enter the first room, which appears to be a makeshift dentist office, we finally learn exactly why Optics and Design were giving dental tools to the courier to bring to the testing room floor, and seemed to be used for one of the first tests that Lumen was putting Gemma through in this episode, in terms of conflicting physical pain on Gemma to see if it transcends the Severance barrier. And as we see her exit the makeshift dentist room, we see that she is still feeling the physical pain, yet has no memory for anything that happened on the other side of that door, confirming the technology is heading in the right direction. And throughout the episode, we continue to see them flashing back and forth between the different trials that Lumen is putting Gemma through, and finally learning a little bit more about Mark and Gemma's backstory before the accident. And while Mark and Gemma's relationship seemingly started off very happy, we slowly start to see the journey of them becoming more and more distant, starting with the heartbreaking and tragic miscarriage that Gemma suffers, essentially marking the very beginning of all of the difficulties the marriage will eventually go through. During which, in our present timeline, Mark is still unconscious, fighting for his life after the recent experimental procedure that Ragabi put him through in the previous episode, after flooding his chip. As Ragabi not only informs Devon that Mark has begun his reintegration process, but also confirms to her that Gemma is indeed still alive, which Ragabi explains is the very reason that Mark has risked going under the reintegration process in the first place. And during the flashbacks, we also start to see a very dark connection between Mark and Gemma's life and Lumen, and how Lumen seemed to be watching Mark and Gemma for a very long time before the accident even occurred, as we see the very same creepy Lumen dentist that is putting Gemma through all of these trials in the fertility clinic that Mark and Gemma visit after the miscarriage, which could potentially point to the fact that Lumen might have been surveilling Mark and Gemma for many, many years, long before they recruited them and long before the accident even occurred, making you wonder if Lumen themselves wasn't responsible for the accident in the first place, in order to get Mark and Gemma both on the severed floor working on this Cold Harbor case file, as the emotional connection between the two of them and their shared history might have made them a perfect fit for this program. We also get a very interesting peek behind the curtains of Lumen in this episode as well, as we see Drummond in a very mysterious room that seems to be a surveillance room of sorts, watching each of our 4 MDR employees refine. And one thing I found even more interesting was how each one of the surveillors watching our MDR employees bore a striking resemblance to who they were watching at the time. The one watching Mark looked a little bit like Mark. Helly's a little bit like Helly, with Dylan and Irving's also looking similar to them as well, which, if nothing else, definitely invoked a similar feeling to the shadow twins that we saw guiding our 4 MDR employees on their trip to Woe's Hollow. And while I don't think these are the same shadow twins we saw in episode 4, they do, at the very least, share the parallel of resembling one another. And during the scene, we also get the sense that this dentist has a very unhealthy fixation on Gemma, as even Drummond is forced to remind him that at some point he is going to have to give her up, while also remarking on the ridiculous sweater that he was wearing at the time. You definitely get the sense that this creepy dentist has formed a very deep connection to Gemma and has fallen in love with her, albeit in the most unhealthy of ways. And you certainly see that all of the grueling trials that Gemma is being put through have definitely been taking their toll on her, as she does reach an inevitable breaking point and tries to ultimately escape, which she actually comes very close to successfully doing if it wasn't for Mr. Milchick stopping her in her tracks. Which, if nothing else, was a little bit disappointing and very ironic as well. After all, at the beginning of the season, we hear Milchick say to the MDR employees that he does not want to be their jailer, while at the same time being exactly that for Gemma, which does paint Milchick in an even more unfavorable light, as he has seemingly known this entire time what exactly Lumen has been doing to Gemma and has been okay with it, which was something we got a small hint of in Season 1 when Milchick says to Cobell that the technology is working, and how it's good that Mark and Gemma don't remember one another. But ultimately, before Gemma can make her escape, she heads into the elevator, which activates her Miss Casey persona, making her much more docile and easy to control as Milchick sends her back to the testing room floor. Meanwhile, back in the current timeline, Devon is becoming increasingly worried about Mark and his health, and even goes so far as to suggest calling Cobell for help, something that deeply worries Ragabi to the point where she flees. And I did think this was a very out-of-character move for Devon in the first place. With her knowing who and exactly what Cobell is, you would think she would be the last person she would ever contact in a situation like this, although desperation does tend to cloud one's judgment from time to time. And back during our flashbacks, we continue to see that Mark and Gemma's relationship is becoming more and more strained, as they are struggling to conceive. And as my co-host, PM Philosophy, pointed out, we see a perfect metaphor for their relationship falling apart in real time, as Mark is struggling to put together this crib, ultimately seeing it fall apart in front of him, with the shattered remnants of this cradle before him perfectly representing where their marriage is heading. And while we continue to see Gemma being put through these inhumane trials, we really get a glimpse at just how dark and depraved this Lumen dentist is and how deep his obsession with Gemma truly runs, as he tries to convince Gemma that Mark has moved on and remarried and even had a child with someone else. And as far as deception goes, this is one that Lumen would probably be able to prove rather easily to Gemma. After all, in this situation, all it would take is a tiny bit of surveillance footage of Mark and Helly together to prove to Gemma that this is true. And we also see another very interesting parallel between this depraved doctor and what he is trying to put Gemma through, and how it relates to Mark and Gemma's real marriage breaking down. In the incredibly creepy Christmas room, where Gemma is forced to write over and over again countless thank you notes, we start to see the doctor say "I love you" to Gemma upon leaving the room, something that Gemma doesn't say back initially, which he prompts her to say, which directly parallels the last meeting we see between Gemma and Mark just before she leaves and has her inevitable accident, as Gemma says "I love you" to Mark, with him not saying it in return, at least not without Gemma prompting him to a second time. As we see Gemma departing for a game night, which would ultimately be the final time her and Mark ever see each other. As we later see a few officers arriving at Mark's doorstep, most likely to inform him about the accident, during which we get one of the most beautiful scene transitions in the entire episode, showcasing Jessica Lynn Gagney's phenomenal cinematography work, with the episode eventually ending with Mark finally waking up in the current timeline after passing out at the end of the previous episode. And if nothing else, it should be pretty interesting to see if there are any lasting side effects to Mark's psyche after flooding his chip in an attempt to speed up the reintegration process, which hopefully doesn't compromise it. After all, it would be very ironic that an attempt to speed up the reintegration ultimately causes the reintegration to fail, which hopefully is not the case. But overall, I thought it was a phenomenal episode that finally gave us an inside look as to what Lumen is really doing down on the testing room floor, and what they are potentially putting Gemma through, and why, and how Mark and Gemma may have been specifically chosen for this task long ago. It definitely was the kind of episode that felt like we got a slight peek behind the curtain as to what Lumen is really doing, while of course keeping a big question still intact as to what exactly Cold Harbor is, and what is ultimately in the Cold Harbor room, and what will really happen to Gemma in the long run once 100% refinement is reached, and if there will even be any Gemma left at all after that, or simply just Miss Casey. After all, I always thought that there could be a very heartbreaking ending to this story in the future, where they do eventually rescue Gemma, only to realize that they can never recover Gemma ever again, and Miss Casey is all that remains. So if nothing else, these final 3 episodes should be very intriguing to say the least. But that is going to do it for our Episode 7 breakdown of Chikkai Bardo. And definitely leave your thoughts and comments down below. Where do you see these final 3 episodes going, and what will ultimately happen to Gemma when we reach 100% refinement? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like on your way out, and consider subscribing to stay up to date on all of our upcoming Severance content. And as always, keep those tinfoil hats on, folks, and I will see you on the next one.
Why are you wearing that stupid sweater?